Hello, thank you very much for joining our webinar series. My name is Nargiza Latgate, and I am from the University of Florida. I'm delighted to launch the webinar series dedicated to publishing best practices. These webinar series are presented by the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems and the University of Florida Libraries. Today's webinar is called Being Aware, Overview of Publishing Ethics and Best Practices. This webinar will provide a broad overview of research integrity issues related to scholarly publishing. It will also highlight some useful guidance resources, which we will cover more in depth during subsequent sessions of this webinar series. Next slide, please. Let me now introduce our presenter. Dr. Terry Keith-Selfie is an experienced clinical investigator with specific expertise in the planning and execution of clinical trials involving mind-body therapies for chronic conditions related to aging and stress. She received a Doctor of Chiropractic degree from Palmer College of Chiropractic and a PhD in Educational Research from the University of Virginia. She also completed an NIH-funded postdoctoral fellowship in clinical research at the University of Virginia's Center for the Study of Complementary and Alternative Therapies. Dr. Selfie's research background serves her well in her current position as the Translational Research and Impact Librarian at the University of Florida. I will request all the participants coming in to mute their mics, please. Thank you very much. And now, before we start, I'd like to go over some housekeeping for today's webinar. This webinar will be recorded. It will go for about an hour. Please keep your microphones mute during Dr. Selfie's presentation. Write your name, position, and institution and your email in the chat box. The recording of the webinar will be available on the Livestock Labs website. I will drop the link in the chat box. When you go to the link, you will find webinar recordings and PowerPoint slides available in English and French. I will shortly share the PowerPoint slides in French for those who can follow this presentation in French. Please note that we are presenting in English. At the end of Dr. Selfie's presentation, we will have a short question and answer session. Therefore, please write your questions and comments in the chat, which we will address at the end. Now I will hand it over to Dr. Selfie.
Thank you, Nargiza. So today we're going to be specifically looking at the COPE principles, the Singapore Statement, and recommendations from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, all addressing topics on research integrity issues related to scholarly publishing. And we're going to start this by looking at the publisher's responsibilities. For organizations in the scholarly publishing field, the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE, the Directory of Open Access Journals, the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association, and the World Association of Medical Editors came together to identify best practices and set forth 16 areas on which journals seeking membership in any of their organizations would be evaluated. I'm not going to cover all of these in depth. These are things that are expected of the publishers, not authors. That said, I do want to touch on them because having an overview of what are considered best practices for publishers is important. They're a large component of the scholarly publishing environment, and what they do has an impact on ethical standards across that environment. Also, this information can be helpful to you when you're choosing a journal in which to publish your articles. And we'll revisit some of these ideas in a future session when we discuss predatory journals. So briefly, this set of principles and best practices state that the journal's website should not contain misleading information or try to mimic another journal. Likewise, the journal name should be unique and not easily confused with another journal. And ownership of the journal should be clearly indicated. Also, the journal should disclose whether the content undergoes peer review and describe any peer review processes. The principles also state that journals need to have governing bodies with members who are recognized experts in the subject area, and the contact information for the editorial team needs to be provided. Any publication fees need to be clearly stated, as do the copyright and licensing policies. Information regarding sources of revenue, advertising policies, and direct marketing activities needs to be provided. And journals also need to disclose their plan for article access in the event that the journal is no longer published. The journal's publishing schedule needs to be indicated, as well as the means by which articles are made available to readers. Any subscription or pay-per-view fees need to be stated. And the last two principles I want to highlight are directly related to what authors submit. So publishers and editors are expected to take reasonable steps to avoid publishing papers where research misconduct, such as fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism, occurred. And finally, journals need to have policies on publishing ethics, and they need to make those policies apparent. We're going to look at this last item a little more closely. Here is an example of how the journal Livestock Science presents this information. This is a snip of their guide for authors. And you'll see it covers many of the topics that we've mentioned. And I'm just specifically highlighting to the declaration of interest and author contributions that were covered under the best practices for publication ethics heading. So this, again, this is from Livestock Science. And in that guide for authors, you saw the heading for declaration of interest. This is the section that describes their policy related to potential conflicts of interest and gives some examples of interests that should be declared. This journal requires authors to disclose any interests in two places: a summary declaration in the manuscript itself, along with detailed disclosures on a separate declaration of interest form. And we'll be coming back to this in our third session in the series when we talk more about transparency. And another COPE requirement under the publication ethics heading was a requirement for a policy on authorship and contributorship. And this is the relevant policy from Livestock Sciences Guide for Authors. They require that each author's contributions be described using the credit roles, credit being the contributor roles taxonomy. And here again is something we'll be covering in more detail in a subsequent section. In this case, actually, our next session is going to be focused on authorship principles. So we'll be covering this in more detail then. So up to this point, we've been talking about what is expected of publishers and journals related to ethical publishing practices. Now we're going to switch the focus to the responsibilities that researchers have in maintaining integrity in the publishing process. We'll start by introducing the work of the World Conferences on Research Integrity Foundation. Their mission is to promote research integrity, that's standards meant to ensure trustworthiness and validity of research. And they do that through supporting the ongoing development of the World Conferences and all related activities. They outline researcher behaviors that can impact research integrity in negative and positive ways. On the negative end of the scale, we've got research misconduct. And that is the fabrication or falsification of research findings or plagiarism of others' work. Then the next category of behaviors are detrimental research practices. And that includes such things as incomplete reporting and inappropriate authorship assignment. Then finally, on the other end of the scale, we've got the responsible research practices, such as honest reporting, transparent disclosures, and these represent the behaviors that have a positive impact on research integrity. But before moving on to the positive best practices, I do want to give one example of research misconduct. This is one of the cases reported this year on the U.S. Health and Human Services Office of Research Integrity website. And I point out this was one of many from this year, demonstrating that misconduct is still an issue today. This is a relevant conversation to be had. So this particular case involved falsified or fabricated methods, figures, data, and conclusions being reported by a researcher. And this involved multiple published articles as well as some unpublished items. And it also involved multiple falsified or fabricated images and data. And those things seem to be typical of these types of cases. You're generally not seeing where it's, a report like this where somebody just did one thing. There seems to be like a pattern of conduct in these cases. So now we're going to move on to some recommendations regarding responsible practices. The Singapore Statement was the first set of guidelines designed to promote greater integrity in research worldwide. These guidelines were developed with input from 340 individuals from 91 countries at the Second World Conference on Research Integrity that was held in Singapore in 2010. The resulting code of conduct was the Singapore Statement that gives 4 principles of research integrity and goes on to lay out 14 responsibilities. We're going to be looking specifically at the responsibilities related to publishing. And these include items 5 through 9, which cover research findings, authorship, publication acknowledgement, peer review, and conflict of interest. There's also a set of recommendations regarding best practices and ethical standards related to the reporting of research that come from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, ICMJE. These recommendations are designed to guide authors as well as others involved in the publishing process in creating medical journal articles that are accurate, clear, reproducible, and unbiased. These cover the same areas that we'll be talking about from the Singapore Statement, and where the Singapore Statement lays out a responsibility, the ICMJE gives specific guidance as to how to fulfill that responsibility. So I'm going to be presenting both. The first publishing-related item that we'll look at from the Singapore Statement addresses the responsibility researchers have to share their findings openly. And then the ICMJE gives some specific recommendations in that regard. And I should have mentioned earlier, I have throughout this slide deck, I have provided links to the different documents that I'm referring to or websites that I'm referring to. So when you get the slide deck, these should all be live links that will take you to the relevant information. Okay, so the ICMJE recommendations are extensive. They cover the conduct of research as well as the reporting of findings. And here I've provided the URL for the full document. I've also provided the URL for the French translation, but know that ICMJE has a disclaimer that they have not endorsed or approved the translation. They do link to it. So I took that as a good sign. So on this slide, I've highlighted some recommendations regarding information to include when reporting your findings that I think are particularly relevant to research integrity. Articles should clearly state the study purpose in the introduction, and that gives an indication that what is reported in the article wasn't just the result of a fishing expedition. The methods section should be detailed enough that others could reproduce the study, and should include a statement indicating the research was approved by an institutional review board or other ethics committee. Results of all of the primary and secondary outcomes should be reported. So no cherry picking of findings. And then any study limitations should be addressed in the discussion section. The ICMJE recommendations also direct authors to look to reporting standards that are specific to their type of research for additional guidance regarding specific content to include. Reporting standards are guidelines that have been compiled by experts that discuss the items that should be included in various types of research articles. They were developed to improve the quality and completeness of research reporting, and many of the items that they recommend address potential sources of bias that are specific to that particular study design. Typically, reporting standards include a checklist of items that should be included in an article, and they also provide an explanation and elaboration article that provides more in-depth information as well as examples. The Equator Network is an excellent site for finding reporting standards that are relevant to your study design. At last check, actually, I've looked at this since then. As of September 26th, there were 579 articles. I looked at this a little after that, and it was at least 580. So numerous reporting guidelines, and it continues to grow. I did highlight a couple that I think might be particularly relevant to this group. So REFLECT for reporting randomized controlled trials for livestock and food safety, and ARRIVE, which is animal research reporting of in vivo experiments. And that standard was designed to ensure the transparent and thorough reporting of animal research studies. The next two items from the Singapore statement have to do with the researchers' responsibilities around contributions to publications. So those meeting authorship criteria should be included as co-authors, and those significantly contributing to the research but not meeting authorship criteria should be acknowledged. And here again, ICMJE has some concrete recommendations. They lay out 4 criteria that all authors should meet, and also assert that anyone meeting all of the criteria should be named as co-authors on the paper. So briefly, authors should have made substantial contributions to the conception or design of the work, or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data for the work. They should have been involved in drafting or critically revising the manuscript. They should have final approval over the version to be published. And they need to agree to be accountable for the work. And as mentioned earlier, our next session, we're going to be talking about authorship. So again, we'll be diving more deeply into this. The next Singapore Statement item related to publishing has to do with the responsibilities of peer reviewers. And basically, they should provide fair and rigorous evaluations of the work that they're reviewing and maintain confidentiality regarding that work. And we will again look to ICMJE for guidance. And they remind peer reviewers that manuscripts that are sent to them to review are the confidential property of the authors. Details of the manuscript should not be disclosed, and reviewers should refrain from appropriating ideas presented in the manuscript. I actually find it a little sad that that last point even needs to be put in writing. That just seems a given. They go on to say that if the reviewer has any relationships that could potentially bias the review, they should disclose that to the editor. And if there are any like outright conflicts, the reviewer should just recuse themselves from the article. Ideally, any conflicts would be evident in the information that was provided in the invitation to review, in which case the reviewer would just decline the request in the first place. So the previous slide, we talked about potential conflicts of interest in the context of serving as a peer reviewer. And here in item 9 of the Singapore Statement, the item on conflict of interest, this is addressing the researcher's responsibility to disclose all financial and other forms of support that could compromise the trustworthiness of their own publications. The ICMJE guidance gives examples of sources of support that could pose potential conflicts and should therefore be disclosed. And they specify that sponsor roles in the research or any restrictions that sponsors place on reporting the findings be included. Additionally, authors should provide information regarding the nature and extent of their access to all of the study data. And ICMJE also provides a form that can be used to address all of the required disclosures. So why are conversations about publishing ethics important? Well, potential breaches of publishing ethics continue to occur. So, for example, the journal Science recently published an article calling into question a number of articles published on Alzheimer's, saying that the images showed signs of fabrication. And this includes articles published in respected, legitimate scholarly journals. To be fair, this has not been proven yet, but if the allegations are true, progress on Alzheimer's may have been set back by years. And you can see there are headlines even in the popular press. So public trust in research seems to have already been negatively affected. A lack of integrity by one individual can have far-reaching implications. Funding agencies can end up wasting money on bogus research, and other potentially valid lines of research end up going underfunded. Other researchers can end up being misled by false reports and then waste their time trying to replicate findings that never really occurred in the first place. If regulators approve drugs based on bogus reports, patients could potentially be harmed. And ultimately, fake research reports shake the public's trust in the whole research enterprise. Of course, the importance of engaging in ethical research practices is not restricted to publishing, which brings us back to the overarching principles of the Singapore Statement that speaks of the need for honesty in all aspects of research, along with accountability, fairness, and good stewardship of research on behalf of others. In this session, we took a broad overview of research integrity issues related to scholarly publishing. We looked at the COPE principles of transparency and best practice in scholarly publishing, the Singapore Statement from the Second World Conference on Research Integrity in 2010, and the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors' recommendations related to publishing. In addition to the links that I provided to relevant resources throughout the slide deck, I've also included this final resources slide that has multiple links, as well as a few things that we didn't cover in the slide deck. The Montreal Statement, Amsterdam Agenda, Hong Kong Principles, and Cape Town Statement were products of other world conferences on research integrity that may be of interest to you as well. So at this point, I will go ahead and turn it back over to Nargiza.
Thank you very much, Terry. This was a very insightful presentation. We are now open to take your questions. You are welcome to unmute and ask your question, or type your question in the chat. Terry, there is a question from one of the participants, and I believe it is in relation to some of the information you were sharing early on. The question was, what is detrimental?
Oh, yeah, I don't want to make anyone dizzy. Let me see if I can get back. So this was, we mentioned detrimental research practices that were mentioned by the World Conferences on Research Integrity Foundation. So detrimental are things that they're kind of in between research misconduct and responsible research practices. So they don't rise to the level of outright research misconduct, but they are research practices that have a negative impact on the trustworthiness and or validity of research. So examples related to publishing that they gave were things like inappropriately assigning authorship or incomplete reporting of findings. So these things, while they wouldn't be considered outright research misconduct, they are not best practices. They do have a negative impact and would be considered a detrimental research practice. Does that help?
I believe so. Thank you for resharing and reinforcing the best practices. We can take more questions if you have. We have about 20 minutes before we wrap up this webinar. So you are welcome either to post your question on the chat or unmute and ask the question. While we're waiting, perhaps I can ask a question. There is a question.
Okay.
From Dr. Zongo from Burkina Faso. He is thanking for the presentation. The question reads, how to identify series review. I'm not really sure how to interpret this. So Dr. Zongo, if you can unmute and ask your question, that would help. So we address it properly. I guess I can interpret his question as how to identify serious review issues with publishing.
Are you talking peer review?
Okay, here he is.
Hello?
Dr. Zongo. Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Yes, there are now many pirate review.
Peer
They are
review.
not serious. Yeah. Not peer review, but they are pirates.
Pirates.
Yes, pirate review. It's a kind of review just to have money.
Okay.
Predatory,
probably.
Yes, predatory review. Yeah.
Yeah,
but for the serious research, when you want to publish our results, it's necessary for us to have a serious review. But I don't know how to identify them.
Okay, so I believe Dr. Zongo is interested to learn more about how to identify predatory reviewers. And Terry, while you're addressing this, I will share the previous presentation on predatory journals and share the link with Dr. Zongo and all the others.
Okay, and I will be in one of the sessions in this series. We're going to be revisiting the predatory journals again, so there might be more information that would address the question in an upcoming session. I'm not really sure how to. I haven't come across this this issue before. Typically, the peer review, the author submits their manuscript to the journal, and reputable journals they followed best practices, and they have guidelines about what the peer review practice is. And it's, typically they send the manuscript out to usually at least 2 reviewers, and then the reviewers make their comments. That goes to the editor, it gets shared with the author, and then you are given a decision about the manuscript, whether it needs minor revisions or it's acceptable as is, which acceptable as is I think fairly unusual. They usually require at least some degree of revision. Or sometimes it's major revision, and sometimes it's just the reviewers and editor have decided that the manuscript doesn't meet the scope of the journal, or doesn't meet their standard for publication, and it just gets rejected. But as far as reviewers that are not acting in an ethical way, if it's going through a reputable journal, I would expect the editor to catch that and be on top of that. There are journals, like we talked about, there are predatory journals, and sometimes the predatory journals say that the articles undergo peer review, when in fact they don't. I don't know if I'm not familiar with if there are journals, like predatory journals, that are sending manuscripts out for like bogus review. I don't know what can be done about that, other than you just need to be vigilant and not be submitting your manuscripts to predatory journals in the first place. If a predatory journal is doing something, all of the best practice recommendations in the world are not going to help, because they're predatory. They're not interested in following best practices. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for that.
No, this is good. I also shared the link to the previous webinar where we covered
Yes.
about predatory journals. So please go to that link, find webinar 5, and you will get more information about predatory journals and how to stay away from those.
Yeah, and we will be revisiting that to some degree in an upcoming session. One thing that I did want to, since we've got some time, that I wanted to expand upon a little bit relative to peer review, like legitimate peer review, is the under best practices, they talk about the fact that when you're conducting a peer review, you're supposed to be keeping all the information confidential. You're not supposed to be discussing the author's work. But there is, it is acceptable with an editor's permission for, and this is a trend that I have seen, where like a senior researcher is sent an invitation to review, and they use that as an opportunity to train people under them, like maybe pre-docs, postdocs, that kind of thing. And that is acceptable if the reviewer gets permission from the editor. They can share that the author's work with a trainee, as long as like in terms of an educational process. And when they do that, like I say, they need to get prior permission to make sure it's acceptable. And then if they do have a trainee work on the review, that trainee needs to be acknowledged. So I did want to point out, because at one time, I mean, that, and even now, that it seems like this could be viewed as a bit of a conflict. It's like, well, the reviewer was supposed to keep it confidential. Why did a trainee even see it? And that's because they are, journals are seeing, because getting good peer reviews is essential. And we're not taught, it's not part of our education. We don't have a class in how to do proper peer review. So editors see the benefit of having senior researchers helping to train the new researchers in how to conduct peer review.
Okay. Terry, we have 3 more questions and only about 7 minutes to take them.
Okay.
Because I also want to remind everybody about the next webinar. So the first question is, can you explain a little bit on what type of data is being considered as fabricated or or falsified?
Yeah, so a lot of what I'm seeing has to do with images, where people are like taking an image from one study and using that same image in an article supposedly reporting findings from a different study. And people are catching that, which is then cluing them into, uh-oh, there's something going on here. So sometimes it's related to images. Sometimes it's data, it's people just making up data. And I can't think, there was a case that I recently saw, and I can't think of the specific, and this will be coming up more and more. You're starting to see the requirement, at least with in the US, National Institutes of Health, for their funding. They are requiring data management and sharing plans. So there's more of a push for, they want the raw data to be made publicly available. And part of that is in response to this. If you're having to publish all of your, or make your raw data available, it's harder for people to then go back and make changes to that data set where they're just making stuff up. If they do that, I mean, at least there's a paper trail that someone could follow, which should be discouraging people from doing that.
Thank you, Terry. I also posted how I believe the Sprinter looks at data fabrication and data falsification. The next question is from Dr. Isadori Nanda, our country coordinator in Burkina Faso. His question reads, is the question of ethics simply a matter for the researcher or for the entire research institution? Is it not a matter that all research, meaning the ethics issues, that all research institutions should promote?
Yes, absolutely, without a doubt. And even beyond, and that was in part why, like the first few slides that I covered, even though these aren't things, these were things aimed at the publishers and journals. So not things that the researchers or research institutions have any control over. It's just demonstrating that this isn't, there's no one person, no one entity that can do this alone. It involves the researchers and the institutions encouraging a culture of research integrity, and the journals and publishers acting in ethical manners. So yes, it is very much, it requires a global effort.
Thank you, Terry. I have one more question.
Okay.
If reviewers misconduct a manuscript or paper of others, like confidentiality related problem, is there any way of accountability?
Yeah, I don't know. Because first off, I don't know, how is the author even going to know that, like, if I'm sent a manuscript to conduct a peer review, how does anybody, if I'm sharing it with other people, that's not necessarily ever going to be known either by the journal or by the author. So the first problem is, you're relying on the peer reviewer to be acting ethically and following best practices. If somehow you were to find out, as an author, you were to find out that somebody had been talking about your manuscript when they were supposed to be keeping that confidential, the recourse would be to contact the journal editor, and then that editor would have to deal with the reviewer. Bear in mind, often the peer review, this is all done blinded. So as the author, you don't even necessarily know who is doing the review. So it would take somehow or other. I guess the short answer, what I'm saying is a lot of this could be happening and you would never know it, in which case there's obviously no recourse. The only time that there might be a recourse if somehow you happen to know, found out who the reviewer was, and somebody told you that, hey, so-and-so talked to me about this manuscript you submitted. I didn't even know it had been published yet. And you're saying, yeah, it wasn't. It was just out for peer review. Nobody should have been talking about it, in which case you'd contact the editor and it would be in their hands.
Yes, I thank you, Terry. I also understand is when you're working with reputable journals and you're one of the reviewers, you do sign non-disclosure agreements, meaning that the publications that you review, you secure confidentiality, not sharing with the others, and so on. So if there is, if you as an author determine that your article that you submitted for a peer review has been shared, circulated, and so on, then the recourse will be sought by that reputable journal. And this is one of the ways, I guess, to promote publishing with reputable journals and staying away from predatory journals. We are coming close to ending this webinar. I would like to thank you all for joining this webinar and also our presenter, Dr. Terry Keith-Selfie. We will be meeting in 2 weeks to present the next webinar of the series, which is called Being an Author. What does authorship entail? This webinar will share best practices around authorship of scholarly journal articles. We will cover topics such as authorship criteria, statements, responsibilities, and questionable practices. I am shortly going to share with you the save the date for the remaining 5 webinars in this series. Please share this with your colleagues, students, and others in your institution. We hope to see you in our future sessions. Thank you again for joining. Goodbye, and see you in 2 weeks on October 20th.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you all. You can now leave the presentation.